Week 6 of the NFL season is almost in the books, so in today's video, I want to do a reaction to every single game of week number 6. So as I mentioned, week 6 is almost complete. In this video, I'm going to be talking about every single game of week 6 outside of the Monday Night Football game because I'm recording this after the Sunday Night Football game. We will begin with the Thursday night matchup between the San Francisco 49ers and the Seahawks, and we will end with our Giants versus Bengals Sunday night matchup. Real quick, before I actually give you guys my reaction to every game, I did want to go ahead and pop up on the screen what my predictions were for this week. And as you can see, I actually had a very solid week for the most part. With that all said, if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and let's get into it. So as I mentioned, we are going to begin with our Thursday night football matchup between the San Francisco 49ers and the Seattle Seahawks. Coming into this game, I predicted the 49ers to win this one in similar fashion to how they have typically handled business against this Seahawks team. And I would say for the most part, basically everything that I thought was going to happen ended up coming true to some extent. I expected that this Niners team was going to be able to take care of business when it mattered most, primarily in the first half, which they did a pretty solid job of. And then for the Seahawks side of things, I feel like they did a pretty fine job in the second half, but their first half performance just wasn't up to par. In a game like this, if they wanted to win it, they had to perform better, and they didn't do so. Brock Purdy had a really good game. He had 255 yards and 3 touchdowns, but more importantly, 0 interception. In a game that ultimately came down to a 2-possession game, those 2 turnovers that Geno Smith had ultimately kind of came in to bite them in the butt a tad bit. Not saying that if he didn't throw those interceptions that the Seahawks would have won, but it definitely would have helped their case. Now both these teams are 3-3, and it doesn't really look like Seattle has much of a chance of winning this division because it feels like San Francisco is starting to figure things out. Plus, if San Francisco can get Christian McCaffrey back, then it's really no contest. The Niners are just simply the better team and are more likely to win the division. Moving on to our London game of the week between the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Chicago Bears. Again, I got this pick right, and I think for the most part, things went about how I expected it to go. I expected Caleb Williams to come into this game and play his best game up to date because he's going up against a Jaguars team that just simply does not have any gas or juice left in it, and they have a terrible depleted defense, and that is exactly what I got from Caleb. Now, I do want to give him one little feedback. I didn't like the interception. I felt like that was a pretty bad play on his end, but he had 4 touchdowns and he played really well throughout the entirety of the game. Admittedly, that first quarter was a little bit of a slow start for this team. Jacksonville was able to put up a lead after the end of the first quarter, but then after that, this game was really no contest. Jacksonville simply just does not have any juice. It just feels like this team has somewhat given up and that they just don't care about the result of the game. And ultimately, when you go up against a team like Chicago that is pretty good both offensively and defensively, this is going to be the outcome. Now, for the outlook of Jacksonville, let's just be honest. Your guys' season is over with, and I expect this team to be really bad and likely getting a new head coach here pretty soon. And then for the side of Chicago, you have started your season off 4-2, and obviously there's a couple more tests to still determine whether or not this team is any good or not. But you're 4-2 through your first 6 weeks. You got to feel really good about where you're at and where your team is heading because it seems like this team is just getting better and better every single week. Next up, we had a game that was on paper a blowout, but I don't really feel like it was much of a blowout in terms of what I personally think a blowout is. And that is the 51-27 matchup between the Buccaneers and the Saints. It felt like very early on that this Buccaneers team was just going to run away with this game as they had 17 points in the first quarter to the 0 that the Saints put up. And then some Baker Mayfield interceptions, a couple of mistakes here and there, and some good plays by Spencer Rattler and that offense. And next thing you know, the Saints put up 27 points in that second quarter. Ultimately, though, this Saints team just did not have it for the rest of the game. They had a really strong and dominant second quarter, but outside of that, they put up blanks in every other quarter. For the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I feel like if you just played a better second quarter, this would have easily been a much more impressive performance. Yes, you won 51-27, but you scored 20 points in the fourth quarter when the game was already out of hand. So I'm not going to sit here and criticize you for putting up more points in the fourth quarter because, hey, go get your stats, go get your money. But ultimately, I don't really feel like you really deserve to blow out the Saints, if you get my point. The Saints played really well in that second quarter, and if they would have continued to spread that wealth throughout their whole game, maybe they could have made this game really close. But ultimately, as I said, that second quarter was really the only thing this team had, and coming out of the second half, the Buccaneers just laid it on them with 27 points in the second half to the 0 of the Saints. I thought Spencer Rattler played pretty well, given the fact that he was a late-round rookie. I didn't think he played clean. He obviously had the 2 interceptions, but I felt like he made the right plays for the most part. I'm not saying I think he should be the starting quarterback over Derek Carr when Derek Carr does get healthy. But I think for a debut game of a late round draft pick, you got to feel pretty good about what they were able to do against a really good Buccaneers team. I know I sound like I'm really down on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but I'm not. I really was impressed by this victory. It just was that you were so dominant early on, and then you kind of let it slip away, and then eventually you were able to grasp this lead again and find a way to win the game. So congrats. Then we had one of the biggest and most hyped up games of the week that actually ended up delivering between the Washington Commanders and the Baltimore Ravens. This was obviously the first meeting between Offensive Rookie of the Year runaway in Jaden Daniels versus the two-time MVP in Lamar Jackson. And as I said, this game lived up to the hype. The final score ultimately was 30-23. And again, it was pretty similar to what I expected the game to be. I expected Lamar and this offense to be able to put in work against a Washington defense that simply just does not compete right now personnel-wise. Lamar was comfortable passing the ball. He was comfortable running the ball. Derrick Henry was awesome today per usual. The offensive line dominated. And sure, this Washington defense was able to make some plays like that interception, but ultimately it just wasn't enough to give your offense more opportunities and more chances to get in the game. Really, in my opinion, the big deciding factor of this game wasn't the play of either team. It was the time of possession that the Baltimore Ravens had over the Washington Commanders. The Baltimore Ravens had 36 minutes of time of possessions to the 23 of the Washington Commanders. And I feel like if this game was a 50-50 split time of possession wise, I feel like this game potentially could have been one of those games that comes down to the wire, like the Chiefs versus the Ravens, or maybe even go into overtime. But because Baltimore was able to chew some clock with their run game, convert third downs, and just play a really efficient ball game, they ultimately were just able to wear down that defense and come out with a victory. Now for Jaden Daniels, I thought he played a fine game. It definitely wasn't his best game. It wasn't him versus Cincinnati, but he was still efficient, 24 of 35 for 269 yards and 2 touchdowns with no interceptions. If this Commanders team had the offensive line to run the ball effectively and to continue to pass block him cleanly, I feel like this Commanders team maybe could have won this game, but ultimately got to give credit to both these teams. It was a fun game, and I think these are easily two of the better teams in their respective conferences. Moving on to a blowout game between the Green Bay Packers and the Arizona Cardinals. I won't spend too much time on this one because we kind of all expected this. This is a Cardinals team that just simply does not have the defense to slow down a high-powered offense like this Packers can potentially have on a day-to-day basis. Unless you catch the Packers on an off day, you're just simply not going to be able to beat them because of how good Jordan Love and that offense is, and I felt like this was maybe the best performance of the season from this Packers team. Now granted, like I said, this is a terrible Arizona Cardinals defense. They just simply don't have the talent, personnel, and schematics to match up with this Green Bay Packers offense. Jordan Love had himself a very clean day outside of the interception. He was 22 for 32, 258 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Whereas Kyler Murray also had a fine day, primarily in the second/third quarter. He had a game of 214 yards, 1 touchdown, and 0 interceptions. This Cardinals team could not get the run game going. Trey Benson had 5 carries for 26 yards, and that was really all they could get in the running game. And once Marvin Harrison Jr. was taken out of the game, it really felt like this team just had no chance of coming back to make it a game. I do want to give credit to this Cardinals team. They made this game interesting, which is something more than I would have said if I would have known that this Packers team would have gotten going like they did. So I do want to congratulate the Cardinals for at least making this one competitive, especially when you're without arguably your most talented player. But ultimately, this Packers team just put out a really complete performance and won the game like we expected. Moving on to the Colts versus the Tennessee Titans. Now, Joe Flacco was the starting quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts, and Will Levis took over the starting job for the Tennessee Titans. I'm going to focus this section on the Titans, so I'll just real quickly kind of give my thoughts on the Colts side of things. For the Colts, without Anthony, without Jonathan Taylor, this offense just felt like it wasn't fully clicking, which was to be expected when you have your backup quarterback, your backup running back, and some issues in the receiving core. But Joe Flacco still played a really solid game, had the interception, but played good enough to beat this Titans team. But now moving on to the Titans side of things, it's time we have the conversation about Will Levis. He played terribly, let's just be honest. He was 16 for 27 for only 95 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception, and yeah, 16 completions for 95 yards is just really bad. Anything down the field just wasn't going their way, and it felt like this Titans team was even afraid to even push the ball down the field because they were afraid of having turnovers or maybe having a sack or interception, which is just really saddening for a team that sits there at 1-3 coming into the game. Your backs are against the wall, and you come out there and throw a bunch of slants and underneath stuff and don't push the ball down the field, and if it wasn't for Tony Pollard making some crazy heroic plays, you're probably losing by a lot more. You have guys like Hopkins and Calvin Ridley and all these other players. You got to find a way to move the ball down the field. It isn't like Will Levis is terribly inaccurate and is a horrendous decision maker, even though he occasionally is. It's not like he doesn't have the arm though. Like, he can make these plays, but it just feels like this team just doesn't trust him. I'm not saying Mason Rudolph should be the starter moving forward, but I do think you have to at least consider other options because this is getting a little ugly. Moving on to the debut game of Drake May between the Texans and the New England Patriots. Now, I fully did expect this Houston Texans team to dominate this Patriots team. I thought the Patriots defense would play better, but without some of their key guys and just not having the talent to match up with Houston, this was kind of an inevitable outcome. This Texans team finally got Joe Mixon back, and it finally looked like this offense completely got going. If you guys watched my Texans video, I made it very clear that once this team got Joe Mixon back, that I felt like this offense was going to take it to another level, and that's kind of what happened. CJ Stroud was a lot more efficient, and they were able to rely on somebody else other than CJ Stroud in Joe Mixon. Even though he only had 13 carries, he was very efficient and made the most of them. Now, that's kind of all I have to say about the Texans. If you want more context and more ideas about this Texans team, I've already made a full video on it that I still feel like holds up to this day. So if you guys want to check that out, feel free to do so. But for the Patriots, I felt like this was a solid debut for Drake May. Listen, I didn't expect Drake May to even put up any sort of numbers like he did. Like, I fully expected him to have a really bad day because this Texans team is really good. But I felt like he made some really good throws. He was efficient. He made a couple bad decisions, but I felt like for the most part, his intentions were pretty smart. This team doesn't have a reliable run game. They have arguably the worst offensive line and zero weapons for him to get the ball to. Yet despite that, Drake May still finished the day with 3 touchdowns against this Texans defense. I'm not saying that this guy is a future Tom Brady, but for a first debut game for him to play like he did, I feel pretty good about what I saw. And then the final noon game between the Cleveland Browns and the Philadelphia Eagles went kind of how I felt like it did. Now, I'll say this. Starting off with the Eagles, I feel a little disappointed with how they performed. Yes, this is still a good Browns defense, but ultimately to only put up 20 points and not really have a crazy efficient day was a little bit disappointing. You were able to outgain them in passing yards, rushing yards, yards per play, total yards, so you got the job done. But I expected this team to dominate this Browns team just a little bit more. Especially if you want to consider this Eagles team to be a Super Bowl contender, I feel like you have to be able to dominate these Browns teams. With that said, though, these guys are NFL players, and I do think that Browns defense is still pretty good, so it's not terribly irredeemable or anything like that. Jalen Hurts did not have any turnovers, and I felt like this offense got moving for the most part, but kind of flundered here and there. They really heavily relied on the run game. Hurts had 14 carries, Saquon had 18 carries, Kenneth Gainwell had 3 carries, Jahan Dotson even got a carry. So you can kind of see what Kellen Moore is trying to do with this offense to prevent turnovers. Run the ball with your playmakers, see if they can make some plays in space, get the ball out to Devontae Smith and AJ Brown on efficient plays, and that kind of worked in this game. Moving on to the Browns side of things, I feel like everything that I've been saying on basically every reactions video to these Browns games holds up in this one. The defense does a fine job early on. They make some plays, they create some turnovers, they get you some points, but ultimately this offense is just a straight up embarrassment. Deshaun Watson cannot simply move the ball down the field. It was actually so bad that when they actually converted a 3rd down, I was genuinely shocked. Deshaun Watson just simply is not in the right system, and even when there are things open for him to do, he's just not a good enough quarterback to make those plays. So it kind of goes hand in hand. The personnel around Deshaun Watson is good enough, but Deshaun simply is not good enough, and the playmaking and the schematics of the plays don't really fit to what Deshaun is good at. So both these things are issues, and it doesn't feel like it's going to get fixed unless one person gives in or one person goes to another team. But then we head into the afternoon game, starting off here with the Chargers versus the Broncos. Now, this was a weird game early on. The head coach for the Chargers actually had to leave the game for, I think, some sort of heart issues, so I really do hope that he is okay. But he was able to come back at some point, but it was still a weird thing, and I still hope he's okay. Ultimately, this was a pretty solid day for the Chargers, primarily in that first half. The second half wasn't as strong, but they did enough work early on to go ahead and secure a victory. I want to give huge credit to this Chargers defense. They gave up 0 points the first 3 quarters, which is very impressive, especially against a Broncos team that has sort of found their footing offensively. This was the first game where it felt like this Chargers team just really let Justin Herbert cook, and I felt like he played his best game of the season. He was 21 for 34 for 237 yards and 1 touchdown, and even though the run game wasn't terribly efficient, Justin Herbert was able to do enough on the offensive end to give them enough points to beat this Broncos team. For the Broncos, I thought Bo Nix played fine. He was, of course, making mistakes. He had the interception. He made some bad plays here and there. This is just a Broncos team that just does not have the talent to help this team win games. If anything, for them to be 3-3 is pretty impressive. They don't have a great receiving core. The offensive line is pretty poor. Their run game is pretty bad. So yeah, I kind of feel bad for Bo Nix, but I still think Bo Nix is playing pretty well. So I feel like you got to feel pretty good if you are a Broncos fan. Moving on to the Steelers versus the Raiders game. Now, this was a pretty interesting game because early on, the Steelers just could not going offensively. They were kicking a lot of field goals, weren't converting on third downs when they wanted to, had some sloppy plays here and there. Justin Fields wasn't playing incredible. And then the Watergates kind of opened in that second half. They scored 12 points in the first half and 20 in the second half, so you got to give credit to Justin Fields for eventually figuring out how to get some points on the board. This was one of those games where Justin Fields wasn't terribly efficient, nor really putting in a bunch of work in the passing game, but running the football, Najee Harris got some big runs going, ultimately finished the day with 14 carries for 106 yards and a touchdown. But when they needed a spark play, when they needed a touchdown, they got it through Justin Fields' legs, as he finished with 11 carries for 59 yards and 2 touchdowns. I kind of feel like for the Steelers offense, we kind of know who they are. They're not a very high, potent passing attack, but if they can get this run game going, they are a good enough offensive unit to win some games. That being said, I wouldn't expect this Steelers team to go out there and beat good teams, but when it comes down to these mediocre to okay teams, I feel like the Steelers are always going to be favored in those matchups. And then, of course, there is the Raiders side of things. I feel like I keep kind of repeating myself with this Raiders team. Whether it's Gardner Minshew or it's Aiden O'Connell, this team is just simply not good enough offensively to really do much of anything. Offensively, they don't have a great offensive line. They don't have the receiving core, especially now that Devontae Adams wants out, and they don't have the running game to really do anything offensively. So unless you're feeding the ball to your playmakers like Brock Bowers, this offense just simply does not have the juice to put up points. This team also doesn't have a quarterback that can actually get you over. This quarterback that they have with Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew just simply is not good enough. And even though I like the pieces defensively, it's still not a complete unit. Yes, the defensive line is really good and has some big names, but the secondary is really weak and gives up big points and big yardage. And when you're consistently not getting points, not having long sustained drives, your defense is constantly out there, and eventually you're going to break because you're just tired and you're not playing at a high level because you're exhausted. So no, I'm not shocked that the Steelers won this game. I thought they were going to win this game, and yeah, I feel like it came to fruition in this matchup. Moving on to the Carolina Panthers versus the Atlanta Falcons game. I'm not going to talk too much about the Panthers in this one because we've kind of gotten to see what this Panthers team is. They have some heart. They are pretty gritty. Andy Dalton is good enough to keep these teams in the games, but they just simply at some point lack the talent, and these other talented teams overcome them fairly easily by the second half. This Panthers defense just is not good. They don't have the talent, they don't have the personnel, and it just feels like they just can't match up with these pretty solid offenses. And because the defense isn't doing well, you have to rely on the offense, and the offense just simply cannot keep up with these other highly potent offenses. I like Chuba Hubbard. I like Deontay Johnson. I think Andy Dalton's done a fine job, but they just simply are always out-talented and sometimes even out-schemed. Whereas for the Falcons, I kind of feel like this Falcons team is somewhat of like a mini Detroit. Now, I don't want to directly compare the two teams because they do have their differences, but I also feel like they're actually kind of similar. These are two teams that have good offensive lines, two good running backs, a quarterback that doesn't turn the ball over and makes plays, and some good weapons that can do some things with the ball in their hands. For example, you got Drake London, you got Darnell Mooney, you got Kyle Pitts, Ray McLeod's been playing pretty well. And in the backfield, you got Tyler Algier, who's sort of your David Montgomery type of guy. You got Bijan, who's a bit more of your Jahmyr Gibbs type of guy. And then, of course, the comparison between Kirk Cousins and Jared Goff is pretty easy to make. So I'm not saying this Falcons team is as good as Detroit, but I feel like they're pretty similar in a lot of ways, and that's really what makes this Falcons team kind of scary. Because I feel like defensively, they're starting to get better week by week. It's still not a perfect unit. I still think the defensive line isn't the strongest, and they're having some injuries in the secondary, but I feel like it's a good enough unit to get this team into the playoffs and maybe to win a playoff game here and there. And with this offense that they have, I feel like they stand a chance against every team. So for that, congratulations to the Falcons. You actually kind of have a respectable offense for once. And then we get to the biggest beatdown and embarrassment I have seen from this Cowboys team in a long time. Now, as you guys can see, I'm from Dallas. I live in Dallas. I'm a Dallas Mavericks fan. I even like the Dallas Cowboys. But I'm not gonna lie, I thoroughly enjoyed watching the Lions kick the Cowboys' ass. Let's be honest, the Cowboys kind of had this game coming at them. Now, I want to be fully transparent. I did think the Cowboys were going to win this game. It was a horrific pick on my end. I don't know what I was thinking. In my defense, I thought that Deron Bland and Kalen Carson were going to play, but even if those guys did play, they were still going to get their asses kicked, so that's just my fault. It was a terrible pick. But getting back to what I was saying, Dallas kind of had this game going for them. If you look back at this Cowboys versus Lions rivalry, quote unquote, the Cowboys have gotten some beneficial calls to go their way to win these games. Let's just put it like that. Obviously, the 2014 playoffs kind of speak for themselves. The Lions probably could have won that game if it wasn't for a questionable pass interference that was not called. And then last year, you had the whole Dan Skipper thing that cost them the game. So in this one, where the Cowboys had like 15 injuries both offensively and defensively, the Lions were trying to go out there and embarrass them, and yeah, they did so. They even had a play out there where Dan Skipper played at wide receiver and ran like a slant. They did a hook and ladder with Penei Sewell. They tried to give Dan Skipper his redemption in the touchdown. I mean, they were just toying with him. They were doing tricks, they were doing everything, and it all worked because this Cowboys team sucks. I don't really have much more to say in praise about this Lions team. This was arguably their best performance of the past 2 years. They went in there, kicked their ass, and hopefully Aiden Hutchinson is okay for the long run. Obviously, he's probably out for the season, but I hope he's okay. And then for the Cowboys side of things, listen, I've already made my case very known about this Cowboys team. I've talked about them pretty consistently and just how disappointing they've been this year. I think this was easily Dak Prescott's worst game of the season. He was just god-awful. The run game continues to be non-existent. The offensive line looks worse and worse every single week. This team is incredibly unphysical. They are afraid to tackle. They are so limited defensively. And now that they're injured, they're one of the easiest teams to blow out in the entire NFL. This Cowboys team will likely win like 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10 games this year, but they're not going to beat any good teams. In fact, anytime they go up against a team that can actually run the football, they're probably going to lose in pretty humiliating fashion. By the way, if you look at their next 4 weeks, yeah, good luck to Dallas. You're probably going to get smoked in almost all those matchups. And then lastly, we end the video off with the Sunday night football game between the Cincinnati Bengals and the New York Giants. For Cincinnati, this was definitely not a clean performance. You only put up 17 points against a Giants defense that isn't spectacular. You didn't have a run game, but you got the job done. I feel like on most days, this Bengals offense is going to play better, so I'm not panicking about how they performed. I just would have preferred them to play better. Again, a win is a win. You'll take them because you need every single one of them. And then for the New York Giants, listen, this is a very disappointing loss because you probably felt like you could have won this game if a couple of plays do go your way. And I kind of feel like if this team had a Malik Neighbors out there, they maybe could have actually won this game. I want to give a huge credit and shout out to Daniel Jones. I know they only scored 7 points, and I know he had an interception, and I know he made some bad throws here and there. But one thing I'll say about Daniel is he's fighting, he's trying. He kind of looks like the guy that was really good in 2022. Is he perfect? No. Is he incredibly accurate and has great decision making? No, but he's trying, and it actually looks like he cares, and he's playing pretty darn well. Again, this offensive line isn't great. They have no run game. Without Malik Neighbors, they just don't have any playmakers, and I feel like Daniel Jones looks okay out there. He looks like he belongs. So for the Giants, obviously you want to get Neighbors back, and obviously you're probably not a playoff team, but I think you may want to reconsider Daniel Jones because I feel like he's playing some good ball, and I feel like we have to give him at least a little bit of credit for doing so. But ultimately, again, I wanted to pop up my predictions here. As you can see, I got most of my predictions right, only 2 wrong, so I'll take what I can get. But if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.